Hello. Did you ever notice the engineer seems to be first and the doctor follows in the footsteps? The world must be upside down. But anyway, this is a very important topic that I'd like to discuss today because of the clinical and practical significance. So first, disclosures, standard disclosures. I have no financial ties to big pharma, diagnostics, or medical device companies. To expand the disclosures, I have no financial ties to the food industry. I'm the owner, as Aaron said, of a medical practice. I'm the author of Eat Rich, Live Long, along with Ira Cummins. I'm a board member of Heal Clinics, and I organize these medical nutrition conferences. So did you ever notice when you look at weight loss figures and graphs in clinical trials that they take on this appearance of a check mark? And by that I mean during the first 6 to 12 months, you see this weight loss, maximum weight loss, and then you hit this plateau at the bottom, and then the weight starts to creep back up. What's going on? Well, I have some examples. So here's the SHI study that Dr. Einfeld mentioned this morning, and you can see in the purple that, well, low carb wins when you compare it to other diets, but there's a check mark in all of them. And so my interpretation is a little bit different than Dr. Einfeld's, that there's something going on with all these diets that you see a check mark. Here's a bariatric surgery study, and you can see that the big gastric bypass on the bottom in the red, you get the maximum weight loss, but there's the check mark. Here's this famous Stanford A to Z study. Again, no argument, the low-carb diet wins, but the weight starts to creep back up. So the question is, what's going on here? Why does the weight come back up? How can we prevent that, and what can we do to stay healthy? So look, you know we're all low-carb advocates here in the room, but when it comes to the question of the long term, is low carb enough? So I want to look at a couple diets. And here's some pie charts looking at macronutrients. And we're using the color palette from MyFitnessPal. And interestingly, they use fat in the red color, a little bit of subliminal messaging there. But here's your typical low carb high fat, where 70% of the calories in the red come from fat, 20% in the green, from protein, 10% carbohydrate. And the focus again is on the macronutrients. A variation would be the paleo diet, where you perhaps eat a little less fat, a little bit more protein, a little bit more carbohydrate, but poorly represented is you're not addressing the macronutrients, the nutrient density, and the quality of the food that, of course, is important. Then we have your typical low-fat, low-calorie diet, where calories is all that matters, and since fat is energy-dense, you should eat less and replace it with carbohydrate, up to 55%. This one's kind of humorous. We call it the perfectly balanced diet, where a third of the macronutrients, or a third of the energy rather, comes from each macronutrient. This has to be correct because it's mathematical precision, right? And then we have the protein-sparing modified fast, which looks like a high protein type of diet. Now, protein-sparing refers to sparing lean muscle mass, but you'll see that it's actually a calorie-reduced diet. And at the end of the talk, I'd like to explain how a protein-sparing modified fast is very similar to low-carb, high-fat keto. And last but not least, and poorly represented, is fasting, where you just don't eat. But again, poorly represented is that it doesn't account for the fact that feeding is time restricted. And so it's actually been shown that eating less frequently may help to increase resting energy expenditure, just like a low-carb, high-fat diet. But the question is, we're looking at the long term, and which of these diets are addressing hormones, calories, metabolic health, metabolic disease, the nutrient density? So we want to take a look further. So I'd like to do a couple of minutes of comparing the hormones to the calories. So as you know, Gary Taubes was here a couple days ago, and I had first met with him here back in 2011. And what does Gary Taubes have to say about all this? Of course, he says that adiposity is a hormonal disease, and insulin is this fat storage hormone, and you therefore simply focus on insulin. and you'll address insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, and metabolic syndrome. But the question is, again, when it comes to the long term, is that all you need to focus on? Well, look, on the short term, Gary Taubes is right, because it turns out that almost 2/3 of the US population over age 45 are currently pre-diabetic, diabetic, or they have some form of metabolic disease. So across the board, it's a good recommendation to tell people to reduce carbohydrates and to reduce especially processed carbohydrates. So here's a picture of a dam. What happens when you're insulin resistant? The energy is trapped like a dam. You cannot tap into it. So you treat insulin resistance with a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diet. It reduces insulin levels, insulin resistance improves, and all of a sudden, you oxidize fat, and it's opening up these insulin floodgates, the energy is available, and it comes pouring out. And there's a metabolic advantage for diabetics when you understand the physiology. And these high-calorie diets seem to defy thermodynamics. How can that be? Well, it's just that you're not accounting for the energy properly. And of course, we know that eating less is spontaneous. And there's a psychological advantage because we're telling our patients to focus on satiety rather than deprivation. That's great. But in this scenario, maybe calories don't matter. But imagine this, you have a diabetic patient, goes on a ketogenic diet, loses a lot of weight. I will guarantee that if that individual continues to eat the same way that they were at the beginning, they're going to hit the plateau and the weight's going to come back up. And so that brings in the aspect that yes, the quantity and the calories do matter. So what about the calories? Let's take a look at that. So Gary Taubes does a nice comparison between the issue of the calories versus the insulin, and he asks these two profound and simple questions. The first question, are we fat because we overeat? That's really in support of calories in, calories out, that we're gluttons and sloths. But then there's a second question. Do we overeat because we're fat? Which suggested that there's a metabolic disease that starts first, and that's what's driving our appetite. Guess what this reminds me of? The chicken and the egg. Now, when we're trying to figure out what came first here, I think when it is the argument about the calories and the insulin, I think we have to consider both. So more about the calories. Here's an Endocrine Society scientific statement from George Bray et al. Last year. And what do they have to say about this? They say that weight gain starts with a positive fat balance, so you begin to accumulate fat. Then you see the subcutaneous fat expansion. It leads to dysfunctional subcutaneous fat. And then you get the expansion of ectopic visceral fat. And then metabolic disease ensues. But what you want to realize here is that you can actually gain fat before metabolic disease kicks in. It's not always about the hormones. So we have these two schools, these two divisive schools, and they want to draw a line in the sand. But what I'm suggesting to you is that the two schools come together. So we have the calorie camp on one side, and we have the endocrine camp together on the other side. And they come together in perfect harmony, and we form a new school called the School of Food, Energy, and Metabolism. And best of all, it's bipartisan, my political statement for today. Now, in honor of this new school, I've come up with a new book title. So here it is, How We Stay Slim. Now, you may have noticed I stole some of the imagery from Gary Taubes. Thank you, Gary. But that's the real challenge. And the idea that we want to combine this endocrine and this caloric-centric axis together and to realize that hormones and calories are both important. But this calorie in, calorie out CICO model is just too simplistic. So let's see if we can expand on that. So of course, calories in, calories out is based on the first law of thermodynamics. You simply put things into a bomb calorimeter and see what you get out. But you have to understand the body obeys the first law of thermodynamics, but that's not what it's interested in doing. It wants to process energy. So let's change this. Let's call it energy in and energy out. And again, the interesting part is that we're processing the energy. We have a decision of partitioning the energy, whether we can use the energy immediately or whether we can store the energy. We have a decision whether we can use the stored energy or not. And then the energy outside. What do we do with the energy that's available? And very important is feedback, which is very common in biologic systems. And two examples here are satiety and hormones. So again, you see, it's the processing of the energy that we're really interested in knowing more about. So just to summarize in some detail, again, nutrient partitioning I just mentioned, the availability of the stored energy, the feedback, there's a lot of pathways going on there. What are the most satiating foods that affect these pathways? So we all know if you're diabetic, if you're insulin resistant, a low-carb, high-fat diet does work really well. But you know if you're metabolically healthy, insulin sensitive, complex carbohydrates can also be filling. Don't boo me. So did you know that it takes energy to utilize energy? I think Maria talked about that. So 25% of the energy is needed to metabolize protein, 15% for carbohydrate, less than 15% for fat. Now you have to consider if you eat pre-digested food, well, less energy has to go into metabolizing it. What about increasing resting energy expenditure or the energy out? Now, Ben Bickman talked about uncoupling protein and adipose tissue, brown adipose tissue, releasing energy or wasting energy. That's one pathway. But ketones are high energy molecules, and you breathe it out, and you can also urinate it. Now, I like to think of it as not wasting energy, but if you have metabolic disease, these pathways serve to correct or reverse metabolic disease. Isn't that amazing? And then, of course, if you increase your muscle mass, that's going to help to increase resting energy expenditure. And so again, it's energy processing that is most important. So let's shift to the clinical and show you how we apply this in the office. So generally, we look at 4 body types when patients come in. So we have insulin-sensitive groups and the insulin-resistant groups. So here we have the insulin-sensitive groups. And the one on the left is this slim, metabolically healthy individual, and we hate this person because they can eat whatever they want, and it doesn't seem to matter. At least initially and long term, they might do okay. And we joke that you never want to take nutritional advice from that individual because they can eat a vegan diet, they can eat a carnivore diet, and they never get sick. So on the right, though, interestingly, we have the insulin-sensitive, metabolically individual that's overweight. They have a lot of healthy subcutaneous fat. Unfortunately, it tends to be the female population. And with both these groups that really represent a smaller number in the population, if you put them on a ketogenic diet, it might fill them up, but they're often frustrated because it doesn't do anything. They want a refund. And you measure their metabolic markers, insulin, CRP, lipids, and they're fine. But you have to recognize that there are insulin-sensitive people. And so then we have the second group, the insulin-resistant people. And this is why Gary's right, because it does represent 2/3 of the population. And so the individual on the bottom left is a slim individual that doesn't have to put on a lot of fat, and they become insulin resistant or diabetic very easily. And we refer to them as TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And we see a lot of Asian population that fit in this particular category. And then, of course, on the right, we have the typical type 2 diabetic, dare I say American. It is global, but they have a lot of subcutaneous and visceral dysfunctional fat, and they've got a big problem. And as you know, putting them on a low-carb, high-fat diet initially works wonders because of the physiology. But you know, there's not just these 4 body types. There's this spectrum of insulin, the insulin spectrum that we use clinically to determine where somebody is. So we have the insulin sensitive on the left and the full-blown diabetic on the right. So depending on your sex, your age, where you are in your life, this can change. And you use your metabolic markers to figure out where somebody is, and this helps us clinically. So why is it that we have all these different body types? Well, the personal fat threshold helps to explain it. And simply stated, the personal fat threshold describes how much subcutaneous fat your body can hold before it says, I'm full. And then the energy needs to go somewhere else. It starts to spill into visceral fat in the middle, and then the organ fat on the right. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. So if you look on the left at the subcutaneous fat, here's an individual that tends to accumulate just a little bit of subcutaneous fat before the system fills up. We have a second individual. Okay, they can store a little bit more subcutaneous fat. And then we have a third individual that can store a lot of subcutaneous fat. But at some point, it becomes dysfunctional. Uh-oh, where's the energy going to go? It spills into visceral fat. And then that fills up. That becomes dysfunctional. We've got a big problem now. There's almost no place to go. We find a home in the organ fat, and you get fatty liver. And then that fills up. Boy, are we in trouble. We've got inflammation everywhere. Our blood vessels turn fire hot. They get inflamed. The next thing you know, you have a heart attack, and you're a dead person. So that's not a good scenario, but that describes the personal fat threshold. And I think if we can predict the personal fat threshold moving into the future, that'll help us clinically. So let's shift gears and talk about aging gracefully, and I have a little figure of the mitochondria. So why is aging and the mitochondria connected? Well, that's where cellular respiration happens and energy is processed. But there's a byproduct. There's actually 2. The byproducts are unwanted heat and oxidative stress. So I want to try to take you through this and make this simple. So we have a fuel mixture that comes into the body: fat, carbohydrate, protein. So fats, the triglycerides, get broken down into fatty acids. It goes through a process known as beta oxidation, where it's cleaved, and in a state of low glucose, low insulin, or fasting, you also get ketones produced by the liver, another source of energy. You must remember that the triglyceride backbone is glycerol, which is essentially glucose. So when there's no glucose around, you can tap into glycerol. And then in the middle, you have carbohydrate. So carbohydrate runs through glycolysis, and it dives down into the TCA cycle, into the mitochondria, and you get your energy. Now, fat can be used for energy as well, but we think of that more of a building block. So here again are the macronutrients diving through into the cytoplasm of the cell, and it makes its way into those little mitochondria, and then your energy is produced as ATP. And here's your ATP molecule, and it's the 3rd phosphate bond that has all the energy in it, and when it's cleaved, the energy is released, and you can use this for all the other processes in the body to make us live, move, and breathe. Now, I hope I can simplify this, but I'd like to talk about oxidative phosphorylation, and I'm really diving into the inner mitochondrial membrane of the mitochondria. And just remember the simplicity of the fact that we're looking at battery and a motor. And if you don't understand it, at the end, I have not done my job. So, we have fuel coming in, fat, protein, carbohydrate, and that energy gets delivered to the coenzymes NADH and FADH2. And they contain electrons and hydrogen protons, and they get donated or transported through the membrane. So This membrane is the battery, okay? So what happens is the electrons, literally in the yellow, they run through this membrane. They're accepted at the end by oxygen. And the energy from those electrons are used to pump hydrogen protons across these complexes 1, 3, and 4. And so over time, you see more hydrogen protons on one side than the other. You've created an electrochemical potential. Another word for that is a battery. So like any battery, it wants to discharge itself. So how does it do that? So there's this structure on the right known as ATP synthase. And we think of this as the tiniest biomolecular motor. And through a process known as chemiosmosis, these hydrogen protons literally fly through ATP synthase, and out comes the ATP molecule. Now here's a schematic video of ATP spinning like a motor and spitting out that ATP. And it's fascinating because your body, with all the cells producing ATP, amounts to your body weight in ATP per day. And if that process is stopped, you're dead in 10 seconds, or 6 seconds, excuse me. So now what I'd like to show you is to dive in a little bit further. Hopefully you're following. And to show you that there's actually 2 ways to charge the electron transport chain. So we just went in a little bit deeper, and to show you that there's a rapid charge and a slow charge. The rapid charge is glucose, and the slow charge is fat. So in this example, we're eating predominantly a high carbohydrate meal, such as bread, or we have lots of glycogen stores. Well, again, the glucose runs through glycolysis, through TCA cycle, and the predominant energy is delivered as NADH. Well, what happens to NADH? The electrons and the protons both run through this complex 1, and you have to understand the complex 1 is a very high energy state, and as you move down the chain, energy tends to taper off. And in terms of electricity, when we're talking about a high energy state, we're referring to high voltage, high current, high power circuit. So it's very efficient. The energy rushes through, it charges the gradient rapidly, but there's a byproduct. And the byproduct is unwanted heat and oxidative stress. Now, what happens to fat when you eat a fatty meal, such as bacon? Well, it turns out through beta oxidation, you end up producing a significant amount of FADH2. So what happens at that level? Well, it turns out the electrons run through that complex 2 that's tucked away under the mitochondria, or underneath the membrane. And the electrons, although they rush through at that level, the hydrogen protons don't run through until later down in the electron transport chain. So remember I said energy is lower there. So it turns out that fat energy does charge the electron transport chain, but at a much slower rate. It's kind of slow charging. And the positive side effect is that you get less oxidative stress and less heat. So let's summarize real quick. Glucose rapidly charges the gradient. It heats the battery. It increases and it increases oxidative stress. And you compare that to saturated fat, which slowly charges the gradient and decreases oxidative stress. So there's a difference. This is a key point of the presentation. But you also know that saturated fat delivers more energy per gram. And I submit to you that the concept here is that it's fat, saturated fat, that on the long term delivers more safe energy. Does that make sense? So this reminds me of the tortoise and the hare. The question is, what's the competition? Well, the competition is who's going to age more gracefully. So, of course, the hare wants to win the race and get a jump out of the gates, so it chooses the high-energy fuel, glucose. And then it says, well, no, I really want to win this race, so I'm going to add some nicotine, some caffeine, maybe some anabolic steroid. And the rabbits created a fuel mixture that's essentially nitromethane. Imagine the oxidative stress. And then we have the wise tortoise, who chooses the safe fuel, fatty acid. And you know the moral of the story, that the tortoise wins. But I think it is fair to say that when it comes to fueling your mitochondria, it's your choice. But clearly, longevity is an endurance sport. We're getting there. So we've been talking about the charged particles and oxidative stress. We're referring to free radicals. I'm not talking about flower children or conscientious objectors. We're talking about unpaired electrons or charged particles. We also see reactive oxygen species that can be good things and bad things. And it turns out the body has natural antioxidants to take care of it. And so it is when the charged particles and the unpaired electrons get out of hand that we've got a big problem. So the idea is to keep our mitochondria healthy on the left, producing lots of energy and low oxidative stress, compared to the unhealthy mitochondria on the right that are producing low energy and high oxidative stress. Now, Ben Bickman would refer to this as using fat to couple to the mitochondria in a very healthy way. And I've just explained to you how saturated fat, perhaps ketones, are the healthy fuel. So the fuel mixture matters. There's many other things, the effect of ketones themselves of signaling, reactive oxygen species, reverse electron transport. And Jeff Volek, there's a reference. He wrote a paper on mitohormesis, and I would refer you to that. We're almost done. So I'm going to show you, like I said, how a protein-sparing modified fast is very similar to low-carb, high-fat diet. So we're looking at a chart of a low-carb, high-fat diet over time. So this individual, typical low-carb, high-fat, is eating 10% of calories from carb, 20% from protein, 71% from fat, for a total of 2,000 calories. Patient's doing great, losing weight. For illustrative purposes, when the individual eats less, it tends to be less fat. You may not even realize that. So let's see what happens. So over time, dietary fat drops, but now we're accounting for the body fat that we've tapped into. We're oxidizing body fat. We add the two up, we're still at 71% fat that the body's using for energy. 50 grams of carb, 100 grams of protein, 2,000 calories. It appears like nothing has changed. But now let me show you and define this as a protein-sparing modified fast. So here we're eating the same amount of carb, the same amount of protein, but we're just accounting for dietary fat. We add it up, and all of a sudden it looks like 2,000 calories is 1,000 calories. What's the difference? Mathematics. That's it. So I don't care how you add up the math, but the point is there's less calories coming in. And yes, the calories and the quantity of food are important. So here's kind of a summary slide. Ivor mentioned some of these things, and you know about this. So you want to limit processed food. You want to eat real food. Ben Bickman uses alliteration, so I'm stealing the line from Ben, to control your carbohydrate, prioritize protein, and fill with fat. If you're doing this right, appetite will be controlled, but I hope you understand that sometimes you do have to focus on the quantity and calories of foods, and you have to not deprive people of food, but to find ways to control appetite. And there's little tricks of the trade. So supplements are important. Stress, sleep, and sunlight. Sunlight is also important. Movement and activity, really to increase resting energy expenditure with increased muscle mass. Now, I would hope that Gary Taubes and Dariush Maheswarian will agree to some of the concepts here. So I'm trying to bring this together. So I'm going to end with one of my favorite cartoons. And the caption says, FDA to retool the food guide pyramid, citing consumer confusion. Well, of course we're confused. Of course we're confused if these dietary guidelines are turning us into fat, unhealthy food pyramids. So it is our hope that as we move into the future, that these dietary guidelines will keep up with the science. Thank you.